Hello, I'm Jason Littlefield, Executive Director of Empowered Pathways, a nonprofit organization established to increase human potential and well being. This presentation pinpoints the source for the social and cultural chaos, confusion, and division that most people have felt over the past few years. In other words, the barriers to personal and our collective empowerment. Over the past 5 to 10 years, I've noticed these broad societal trends, so I began closely examining our culture, the emerging teachings and practices, and their impact on us. And even before that, for the past 30 years, I've had this continuous curiosity about human nature, our history, our psychology, etc. I began studying us through a cultural lens as an undergrad student of humanities in the 1990s. And around 2017, I noticed a huge shift in society and from within my own immediate professional working community. So I began seeking to understand and articulate to others what I found. Then, a short couple of years ago, things started to feel like this. So, my desire to articulate what is happening at this moment in real time and help us figure a way out and strategies for building dignified communities and over generations, a dignified world and an empowered humanity. After this short presentation, you will understand what is happening in this moment in time. And with that raised awareness, you'll see how you can be part of the solution to building a dignified and empowered humanity locally. And then over time, our joint efforts will connect. As we move towards that sweet spot center of Handmaid's Tale, Fahrenheit 451, 1984, and Brave New World, the expression culture war has been discussed with more and more frequency. And that is exactly what is happening, a clash of two polar opposite cultures. And this is the single greatest barrier to our collective well being. Because in order for a group of people to coexist effectively without harming each other, they must have a shared culture. Therefore, the greatest barrier to our collective and societal empowerment is the culture war. This so called culture war is what I've been analyzing and studying in both a bird's eye view and from an inside the nest kind of way for the past 5 years. And after that, I have a theory that at least 86% of us can unite around a culture that proves itself to be empowering and dignified and reject the undignified culture that's being forced on us. Think of culture as the overarching set of guiding virtues, values, and philosophies that collectively make up the written and unwritten rules and societal norms and practices of a group of people. Culture exists whether we see it or not, whether we agree or disagree. It's like the weather, it's just there and it just happens. Also worth noting, the human brain is wired in a way to accept the culture placed on it, and historically has been forced on conquered groups of people. So culture has been weaponized. Let's look at three composites of culture. Virtues are the traits and qualities deemed to be morally good and serve as a foundation of principles for good moral standards. Philosophy is the systemized study of general and fundamental questions, such as those about existence, reason, knowledge, values, the mind, and language. And finally, values. Values are the concepts deemed important and held in high regard by members of society. Overall, culture greatly impacts the quality of well being and livelihood of all members of society in both direct and indirect ways, as well as mundane and profound ways. Historically speaking, culture has served as the precursor to a society's political landscape. So, understanding this moment is quite important to us and the future of us. The current cultural clash is not only in the United States, but also in Canada, throughout Europe, Australia, and New Zealand. For hundreds of years, these nations have have had a majority culture rooted in the virtues, philosophies, and values of basic human liberalism. Although rooted in virtues, values, and philosophies more than 100 years old, the successor ideology has only begun to be institutionalized and commercialized over the past decade. In fact, this emerging ideology has yet to be properly and commonly identified. Wesley Yang coined the term successor ideology, and I use it because it feels accurate and without judgment. For familiarity purposes, a common term used to describe the same collection of virtues, philosophies, and values is woke. The reason the clash is so intense is that they are the exact opposite of each other and both claim to be the ideal conditions for human happiness. The central issue and difference in the two cultures is how they view the role of the individual in society. Basic liberalism culture views the individual as the moral and political focal point of society, and the successor ideology views the group as the moral and political center of society. The main goal of liberalism based cultures is for humans to live their lives freely and at peace with others. The main goal of successor ideology culture is to erode and replace liberal cultures. Let's take a closer look and compare the cultural composites of each other. The virtues of truth, beauty, and goodness are referred to as the bedrock of human existence. They are said to be attributed to Plato, but have been written about and purposed across the world throughout time and across people. These are said to be the foundation for ethics and pursuits that appeal to all members of our human family around the world and across time. The postmodern influence here claims that there are no standards or need for morality. And truth, beauty, and goodness are social constructs, not virtues worth pursuing. At the heart of successor ideology is revolution, and that is the destruction of liberalism. And in order for revolution to happen, there can never be a status quo or preservation of the past. This is why nihilism is listed as a virtue here. Nihilism is a practice that rejects generally accepted or fundamental aspects of human existence, such as objective truth, knowledge, morality, values, or meaning. Therefore, nothing really matters or is worth pursuing. Another noticeable pursuit of those advancing successor ideology culture is cynicism. This is an inclination to believe that people are motivated purely by self interest and having a sneering disbelief in sincerity and integrity. Let's look at the competing philosophies. Liberalism culture's guiding philosophy is influenced by Aristotle's ethics, Judeo Christian values, and the Enlightenment era philosophy. Aristotelian ethics is the study of character built around the premise that people should achieve an excellent character as a precondition for obtaining happiness. The cornerstone qualities include prudence, justice, temperance, and courage. One of the greatest contributions to humankind so far has been the central concept of Judeo Christianity, and that is a selfless love. Selfless love is recognizing and honoring the individuality of others, even strangers. Prior to this concept, the human experience prioritized groups of people conquering and destroying each other for power and resources. Love thy neighbor as thyself, along with grace and forgiveness, are also key aspects from Judeo Christianity that make up liberal culture. Perhaps the greatest idea ever bestowed on humanity stems from Enlightenment era philosophy, and that is the concept of a free and sovereign individual. The notion that all people are born into this world with the right to pursue their own beliefs, interests, and develop themselves how they see fit without harming each other. This is the idea that has extended and protected human rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness over the past 300 years. The Enlightenment also introduced concepts like separation of church and state, the scientific method, objective truth, and concepts of logic and reason. The overall philosophies of basic liberalism is the individual is society's moral and political center and work in accordance to free the individual from political, societal, and cultural tyranny in ways all people may live in peace with each other. On the contrary, Successor ideology culture believes that each individual is to assume a group identity, and the group is the moral and political center of society. And this is reinforced through its guiding philosophies: intersectionality, critical theory, and postmodernism. Intersectionality is a 1989 idea that states each individual is oppressed or oppresses others due to the entirety of their multiple identity markers, rather than being oppressed or the oppressor by a single identity marker. These identity markers are determined by our given stereotypes of our biological traits. Intersectionality prioritizes aspects of stereotyped identity over a vision of a shared humanity. Critical theory is a 1937 idea put forth by Max Horkheimer. He theorized that a free and liberal society would erode itself over time if it engaged in constant cynical criticism towards itself and its past. Critical theory is a lens to view the world in which through. It's a lens in which people see injustice and inequalities everywhere, in every interaction, in every relationship, every institution, and even every aspect of our past. Critical theory has spurred other critical consciousness movements, including critical gender studies, critical race theory, and critical economic theory, to mention a few. The process of having a critical consciousness means seeing the problem everywhere while envisioning a utopia and having no plan for building such utopia, and transpires into a pessimistic outlook and a mistrust of people. Postmodernism emerged as a popular scholarship shortly after World War II, but has a pre World War II legacy as well. It's a philosophy that rejects absolute meaning and instead embraces randomness and disorder. Postmodernism is primarily a rejection of the entirety of the Enlightenment. Objective, natural reality, logic, reason, human psychology are all considered social constructs rather than universal. Postmodernism focuses on embracing deconstructing, dismantling, and offers nothing for building or creating. Now let's compare the concepts deemed important by each culture. We already distinguished how liberalism prioritizes the individual over the group, so let's see how that transpires in liberal based cultures. Within a given culture, there is an understanding of advancement and process in place for doing so, if advancement is a cultural norm. By advancement, I mean advancing one's own self, advancing into leadership positions, even advancing socially and economically. Basic liberal culture promotes and encourages personal advancement using the concept of meritocracy. Meritocracy is the overall understanding that an individual's life outcomes are largely determined by that individual's efforts, their decisions, character, and competence. And the more effort one devotes to developing oneself, the more advancement opportunities they'll have. The idea that all humans are born with inalienable, God given rights and should be treated equally under the law and within society is another important concept of liberalism culture based on Enlightenment philosophy. This idea has been key to human liberation. A very important value of successor ideology is equity, and in this case refers to equal life outcomes for all individuals rather than the liberal notion of equal opportunity. Even if all individuals are given equal resources and life outcomes, there still has to be leadership in political, the economical, and social spheres of society. And under successor ideology culture, advancement is based on one's intersectional identities. The more oppressed labels an individual can claim, the higher status and power they can obtain. The more oppressor labels an individual is assigned, the fewer opportunities they have for advancement. Successor ideology culture rejects the liberal claim that all are created equally by stating that all are born with labels of oppressed or privileged, and these traits are assigned to each individual according to the traits they were born with. If we can just take a moment to look at these two frameworks as frameworks for building a community and increasing the potential of all members of that community in doing so, which culture do you feel is worth living by and advancing for the future? Grounding ourselves in the virtues, values, and philosophies that are in tune with our core selves is a great strategy for mitigating internal conflict and confusion as well. Understanding that the human brain is wired to adapt to the culture that Understanding that the human brain is wired to adapt to culture it is in demonstrates how neural connections are strengthened, gained, or lost based off of personal thinking, behavioral habits, and environmental factors. This is called neuroplasticity. It means that the shape and structure of our brain is determined by the environment we are in and the attitudes and practices prioritize and participate in. Think of culture as a petri dish to grow life. Which culture do you feel will produce a flourishing life for generations to come, and why is that? Which culture should we guide our brains and those of future generations to follow, and why? Perhaps a third culture is needed. Considering the fact that culture shapes brain health and functioning, we have to consider the impact the emerging institutionalized culture is having on our brains in relation to our psychological and social well being. Let's now explore how this is impacting our personal and collective empowerment. Denying the whole self, along with human dignity between people, is proving to have an adverse effect on us. Throughout our history, this is the reason for all previous historical atrocities, present day injustice, and future transgressions, if not reversed soon. This is why it is paramount for everyone at this moment in time to better understand, choose, and advance ideas that transpire empowerment rather than destruction. Successor ideology culture denies the whole self and human dignity between people by absorbing all individuals into a group and assigning each group as an oppressed or an oppressor label. One thing about the oppressor label is that intersectionality describes how each identity group, in some form or fashion, oppresses one or more other groups. Therefore, most individuals carry both oppressor and oppressed labels. So that magnifies the complexity and confusion of organizing society in ways where groups of people compete for power and resources. Also, under successor ideology culture, all groups have different or conflicting key values. Others are seen as different. People see their identity in terms of belonging to particular groups, and their groups discriminate against others. Now, these bullet points are also the basis for cultivating the psychological capacity for prejudice. Therefore, by advancing the emerging successor ideology culture, we are transforming our human family to forever have strong capacities of prejudice towards each other. We've examined the impact successor ideology is having on relationships by cultivating the psychological capacity of prejudice. Now let's take a closer look at the impact successor ideology culture is having on individual thinking processes, which in turn influence behavior choices and patterns. These 6 thinking traps were identified by Dr. Martin E.P. Seligman, the director at the University of Pennsylvania's Positive Psychology Center. Notice how each thinking trap is activated by an initial response of either fear or judgment. Successor ideology culture claims that individuals are predetermined and destined to be who they are based on the traits of their intersectional identity. So, judgment is a prioritized thinking process of successor ideology culture. Let's look at 6 possible implications of how it is reflected in each of these defined thinking traps. You are either this way because you are oppressed. You think you are this way because you are an oppressor. Things are as is already. If it weren't for the oppressor class, if it weren't for Enlightenment era liberalism, there wouldn't be racism. Also, emotions of resentment, anger, and even paranoia. Mindsets of I'll never achieve because I'm oppressed. Attitudes of I should not achieve because I am an oppressor. And also emotionally cultivates shame, isolation, and anxiety. I'm defined by my biology, and this applies to all identity groups. Emotional reactions of isolation, depression, even addiction can settle in. I've often heard it's the air we breathe. Segregated public spaces are coming back, and obviously that amygdala reaction and increased anxiety and depression. Habits of learned helplessness. So, noticing how successor ideology culture guides human thinking in the most awful and unproductive directions, it appears we are transforming our human family to forever think about themselves and each other in the most awful ways, unless we collectively pause and collectively shift. Let's look at some well being statistics to get a pulse on where we are. What's interesting about this data is that it's from 2020. The world has rapidly changed in such a brief time. I'm wondering how that data has changed, and in light of how successor ideology culture is impacting our personal and collective well being. I think an awareness of the current state of our well being is worth considering as we are advancing a culture that is seemingly accelerating our decline. 21% of U.S. adults have experienced mental illness in 2020. This represents 1 in 5 adults. 5.6 of U.S. adults experienced serious mental illness in 2020. This represents 1 in 20 adults. 16.5% of U.S. youth aged 6 to 17 experienced a mental health disorder in 2016. That's 7.7 million people. 6.7% of U.S. adults experienced a co occurring substance use disorder and mental illness in 2020. This is 17 million people. I think it's worth considering the psychological and behavioral impact of denying the self and the toll of daily dehumanization of the self and others, and prioritized emotional responses of shame and resentment and helplessness, and the rejection of all moral principles and the belief that life is meaningless and there is no objective truth or reality. Noticing this 2020 data and the awareness of how successor ideology is decreasing our well being, it appears we are transforming our human family towards a perpetual deterioration of mental health. Unless we collectively pause and collectively shift. A need to shift is apparent, but towards what and where have not yet reached a critical mass, but I hope we can change that soon, especially because successor ideology culture is being imposed around the world primarily through media, entertainment, institutions, and even politicians. However, the three primary cultural mechanisms imposing it are the diversity, equity, and inclusion departments and initiative, ways of talking about anti racism, and social and emotional learning programming. These three structures now impact each individual. Age pre K all the way through retirement age, and are currently informing and shaping the brains according to successor ideology. Since each of these makes the claim that they are purposed for increasing human potential, human well being, and relationships, replacing their current attitudes and practices with ones that increase human potential, that increase human well being, and strengthen relationships by cultivating the neural pathways to make that possible. Empowered humanity theory is that. Empowered humanity theory is a set of three attitudes and three pathways of practice designed to strengthen humanity's most benevolent traits while mitigating our most barbaric. The first attitude is a value centered identity, which is cultivated by engaging in practices that build awareness and equanimity. A value centered identity promotes one's whole self that also serves as a daily compass for staying true to one's core self. Practices that build awareness of self and others allows for choice in habits and behaviors that best serve ourselves and our communities. Practices that build equanimity allow us to experience and respond to challenging and chaotic moments with a sense of calm and clarity. Decreasing the frequency and intensity of reactive behavior can have a profound effects on our physical, emotional, and relational health. A wide scale understanding that one's true self is truly determined by their chosen core values rather than a set of traits predetermined by their born into biologies, humanity will move from systematically dehumanizing each other towards empowerment. The second attitude is a dignity lens, and this is strengthened by engaging in practices that celebrate our common humanity. Navigating our daily interactions with a dignity lens allows us to connect with each other in ways we can't with an intersectional lens. Understanding that beneath our biologies and personalities, we are all profoundly interconnected allows us to connect and collaborate in ways where we are all seen as having worth and value. Frequent and intentional practices that celebrate our common humanity strengthens our dignity lens. Seek to find pieces of yourself in the stories and experiences of others' whole self with frequent intentionality. This is how we remove the current walls of indignity between us and empower our shared humanity. As we noted earlier, successor ideology culture prioritizes mindsets of fear and judgment. Empowered humanity theory promotes cultivating an attitude that promotes mindsets of inquiry and compassion. It's training the mind to notice the responses of fear and judgment, and when physical safety isn't at risk, replace those fear and judgment based thinking processes with ones of inquiry and compassion. Having a curious and compassionate inner voice decreases negative thoughts about ourselves and each other, and this cultivates empowerment. Rather than being self critical, we can ask, what made me do that so I don't have to do it again? Rather than being critical of others, we can presume positive intent, seek to understand if and see if there is suffering that can be tended to, and then plan for and actualize productive solutions with each other. Neuroplasticity demonstrates that the human brain is shaped by our thinking and behavioral practices and constantly changes throughout a lifetime depending on the practices and thinking habits. And also, the brain is wired to accept the culture that's placed on it. Presently, there is a culture being imposed on our human family, and we are having an adverse reaction to it. Humans are designed to harm each other when they other each other. This attitude is the root of all historical, present day, and future harm. Therefore, it's inherent for the sake of our species that we advance a culture that leads to personal and collective empowerment rather than destruction. Our human family is at a crossroads. Culturally, emotionally, and neuroplasticity speaking, we are on a road to perpetual disempowerment. The road to disempowerment is now the most traveled, most accepted, and most celebrated, and most institutionalized. The road to empowerment is presently the least traveled, the most treacherous, and most daring pathway. However, it is one that I am pursuing, and I hope that you will forge it with me together.